Hi guys, so I am here today for my end of May wrap up. You might recall that I didn't do a mid-month May wrap up for various reasons, but that does mean that I have 10 books to review for you in this video, and there's some really excellent books here, so I want to give them all the time they're due, which means you may want to get yourself a cup of tea or coffee or a cold drink given the weather and settle down. But I'm going to start with the last book I read in the month as opposed to going all the way back to the beginning, because I think it's the most important book of this video. And I read the entirety of this book yesterday on the last day of the month. It was on offer from Haymarket Books for free. Haymarket are one of my favourite publishers. They're incredible. They're really committed to the dissemination of knowledge and radical politics. And because of the sort of resurgence of Black Lives Matter protests in the US at the moment, they made one of their titles free, which is called Who Do You Serve, Who Do You Protect? Police Violence and Resistance in the United States. This is an essay collection. I believe there were 12 essays if I remember correctly, and I wanted to put this at the beginning of the video particularly because it's still free at the moment when I'm filming this and when this video goes live, but it is for a limited time, like it's only free this week, so make sure to go and download it from their website now. Equally, however, if you want to support Haymarket Books, donate some money to them as a publisher, buy some of their books that aren't free, and show your support if you're able, because they are incredible, and I think it's a wonderful thing they're able to do something like give away books about important information for free for those who can't afford it, especially when I know a lot of us have limited access to libraries at the moment, what with the current circumstances. So I basically spent the whole of yesterday afternoon and evening reading this book, and it is incredible. It is such an informative, educational, powerful collection of essays all about, as the title suggests, police violence and the intersection with racism, especially in the United States. Although it does, it focuses on the United States and the United States government, but it does in instances sort of go beyond the United States. It looks in part at sort of United States sort of jurisdiction in other countries where they've got soldiers, and that police violence and racism follows through into other countries, and also just the experience generally and history generally of the African diaspora. But I think this book is an important one for everyone to read, no matter sort of how much you feel you know, but particularly if you feel like you're seeing a lot of information at the moment online or in the news, although it feels like somewhat lacking in the actual mainstream news, about the Black Lives Matter protests that are currently going on, which are in part specifically demanding for 4 United States officers who were involved in the murder of a black man to be prosecuted, which is unfortunately really uncommon for the prosecution of police officers who commit murder, particularly against sort of black men and women. As this book highlights, I'm holding this up as if this is the book, it's not the book. I read it on my Kindle. But also more generally to draw attention to that extreme level of racism and police violence and the intersection between both of those. And I think this book is so educational because it gives you a lot of examples. It's obviously incredibly harrowing to read about, but not something you should be turning away from. But it also looks at like the sort of institutions, which I found very informative about, like the way in which that there's really no monitoring system for police violence. So you can submit a complaint if you feel that a police has treated you unfairly, if you have experienced police violence. But there's no sort of like overarching system by which all of that's monitored, and they check if like specific officers or specific precincts are responsible for multiple offences to sort of see where problems might lie and what might be the systemic sort of root cause of that problem. I had to go and help my mum with something, so I'm kind of lost as to where I was. But basically it sort of reveals all this sort of data about stuff. Like I said, it touches on like soldiers and troops in other occupied regions. It touches on prisons in general, because obviously there's massive overlap there. It touches on, because these are all like 12 essays that all have like a slightly different focus, we do have discussion of the Native American experience, which is also one faced with a lot of racism and violence from the police force. It looks at sort of like the historical origin of this relationship. It looks at the sort of particularly sexual violence faced by women, black women, and it is such an important collection. Like, it covers so much, and it's not really that long. It's very consumable, so it's a piece of education that is currently free, accessible, not terribly long, but full of information that I would really highly recommend that you go and download. So I will link that down below, of course. And I would mention as well that because it touches on the prison experience, it recalled some books that I've read before on sort of racism in the prison system that I would also recommend, like of In This Place Not Of It, Are Prisons Obsolete, The New Jim Crow, the documentary 13th on Netflix are all very relevant, and I would highly recommend that you check out. I will also link some of the fundraisers at the moment. They're raising money to support black people arrested on these protests, so you can find that all in the description box. But then I guess from there I will move back chronologically with the book I finished previous to that one, which is Scottish Folk and Fairy Tales From Burns to Buchan. This is a Penguin Classics edition that collects traditional folk and fairy tales as told by various different Scottish authors. So we've got like specifically Scottish folklorists who collect Scottish folk tales and folklore. We've also got people like Robert Burns, who was a poet. We've got authors who told sort of traditional maybe like ghost stories, etc. And lots of different people collected there. It's amazing introduction really to Scottish folklore, Scottish fairy tales and Scottish literature in general, and I know I get a lot of requests for recommendations of Scottish literature and where to start, and this is something I would highly recommend for anyone interested in Scottish literature or just folk tales and fairy tales in general. It was brilliant. It's one of my favourite books I've read this year. Another 5-star. I had quite a few 5-stars this month, and I couldn't recommend this more highly. I also had some favourites, and since it's a short story collection I thought I would just tell you which ones were my absolute favourites. There were two in particular I loved. Not that I didn't love the collection as a whole, but there was just like these two that really stuck with me. One of them is called Catherine Crackernuts, and that is taken from the Folklore collected by Elizabeth Grierson. And one thing I'll also say about this book is I wasn't familiar with Elizabeth Grierson before reading this, but quite a few of the stories in it are taken from her collections, and I read about the authors, which is a section at the back, and I learned about this woman who was a folklorist, a Scottish folklorist who collected Scottish folk tales, a little bit I guess like the Brothers Grimm's say, and it's made me interested in checking out more published under her name. But Catherine Crackernuts I loved because there is a princess in this fairy tale whose stepmother hates her, so that's a bit of a trope that's not like a favourite, but apart from that, this story just feels so incredibly progressive because the princess is hated by her stepmother and she has a stepsister, but her relationship with her stepsister is so good. They have such like an incredible bond. It doesn't matter that they're not biologically related, it doesn't matter that her stepsister's biological mother hates her. They are on side together, and her stepsister, who is Catherine Crackernuts, helps protect her from her own mother. And then also, the way that this princess continuously saves herself from being poisoned by the queen, and this is right at the beginning of the fairy tale, is that she doesn't listen to people when they tell her not to eat. So the queen's like, you should just, you know, the queen keeps saying, don't eat your breakfast, skip your breakfast, don't eat food, blah, 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 blah. And the princess is like, I'm hungry, I'm gonna eat when I'm hungry, what I want to eat, when I want to eat. I'm not going to skip meals, and I'm not going to be pressured to skip meals. And I just feel like that is the kind of princess role model that we all need in our Disney films. So I loved that. And then to follow on, my other absolute favourite from this collection was about a giant. But what was it called? It was called The Lonely Giant, and this was written down by Alistair MacLean, and oh, I just loved it. It was this really like cute, slightly comical story about this giant who didn't have any friends because nobody else was a giant, and he just basically wanted a family. But there's also just these like really witty little sentiments in it that I adored and was sending to some of my friends because I loved them. And I have to say, now I don't think the last story in this collection is that impactful, say, but it was the perfect way to polish off the book, and that's The Tale, which is from John Francis Campbell. And it just made me like absolutely cackle out loud. It was such like a clever way to end the collection, and I thought the whole collection as a whole was just constructed really well, and that was like a real symbol of that at the end. So I really enjoyed these. I knew some of them. I'd read Tam O'Shanter before, which is a Burns poem. I was familiar with the story of Tam Lin, for example, but others never heard of before, never read before, and it was really fun discovering them. So would highly recommend this. The next book I finished before that was a audiobook, and that was Dead Man's Folly by Agatha Christie, which is a Poirot novel. So Agatha Christie wrote a lot of sort of cosy crime mystery novels in the early to mid 1900s, and Poirot is one of her most famous detectives. You may very well have heard of him because he has been adapted for screen, television and film a gazillion times. Not as much as Sherlock Holmes, but quite often. And this is the first Poirot novel I've read in over 10 years. Like, I used to really like Poirot when I was a teenager, but I hadn't read a Poirot novel in over 10 years because I'm 28 now. And I buddy listened to this with my friend Taylor, whose channel I'll link down below, The Lass in Linen, and she's also a big fan of the sort of classic cozy crime genre. We were particularly drawn to this Poirot audiobook because it's narrated by David Suchet, who plays Poirot in one of the most iconic television adaptations. The one I used to watch when I was a teenager, the one I've always loved, and is like the epitome of Poirot on screen for me. So I thought that was really fun, and I think it really added something to the audiobook that it was narrated by him, because he went from that really familiar accent he does for Poirot to sort of like an English narrator, an English accent, really smoothly, and it just felt like me what Poirot sounds like because I'm so used to that TV show, and I really, really enjoyed that. However, not having read a Poirot novel since I was a teenager, I don't know if I just didn't notice when I was younger or I forgot about it, but Poirot is not a nice man. I mean, he's nice in some respects, but the way he talks about women, not impressed. He is very, very objectifying and judgmental of women, and I was not a fan of that, and I'd completely forgotten that was an element of his personality. But I also think that potentially Agatha Christie wrote him like that not because she approved of it, because recently I learned, when I was doing a quiz with my friend Emma from Drinking by My Shelf, that Agatha Christie described Poirot in quite an insulting manner. So this is a fictional detective she created, but she sort of looked on him quite poorly. So I thought that was really interesting, and now I can understand why. Because the way he was talking about women, wow, okay, was not prepared for that and had kind of forgotten. But overall, it was just like a fun, traditional, cozy mystery. It wasn't like, oh my goodness, so thrilling that I couldn't put it down and desperately needed to know the end, but I enjoyed the resolution. I thought it was a surprise, and I liked how it all rounded up at the end, and it was just quite like a quiet, cozy book to listen to. So that's kind of where I am on that one, sort of middle ground. But then previously to that, I also listened to the audiobook of Deathless Girls by Kieran Millwood Hargreave. Now this is what I've been calling a prequel to Dracula, or an origin story is what Kieran calls it, to Dracula, the classic by Bram Stoker. And it's about 3 female vampires from the original novel. They're often described as the brides of Dracula. Now in the original novel they're only described as sisters, like vampire sisters, but later in film and other adaptations they become sort of like canonized, or just become known as the brides of Dracula. And these 3 female vampires that live with Dracula appear at the beginning of the Dracula novel and at the end of the Dracula novel. They're not given names in the novel, they're just sort of like objects used to create atmosphere and as sort of like a trope of one stereotype of women in Gothic literature. And this novel tells the origin story, or the origin story that Kieran Millwood Hargreave has created for 2 of those sisters. And it is so incredible. It is such a dark novel to start with. It's very, very much in the vein of a Gothic novel. It takes so much inspiration from that genre, but does something so clever and so modern with it. It's set in a sort of like historical, is it medieval or maybe a little bit later period in Romanian history, and we follow 2 traveller sisters when their like traveller community is raided, and they and others from their family and community are taken as slaves. And that is based on historical reality around the historical figure of Vlad the Impaler, who did have a lot of traveller slaves. And it's about them being taken away as slaves, adjusting to their new life, and obviously the looming presence of these vampiric creatures and a little paranormal darkness. It's not like a vampire novel in that there's vampire romance or really any vampire central characters. The vampires are in the periphery. They're this like ever looming danger and representation of the darkness of society. And that's what I loved about it. I loved that this book was about humanity and the humanity of these 2 young women and their experiences and what led them up to ultimately becoming the brides of Dracula. Now, I don't feel like that's a spoiler because this book is marketed as the story of the brides of Dracula before they're brides of Dracula, but you don't know where it's all going to go, how it's all going to turn out, and I loved following that journey. I also was super pleased that this book has fantastic female-female romance representation. I loved reading about that. I think that was really well done and a really wonderful added element that added to the sort of humanity and experiences of one of the sisters. I overall really enjoyed this book, although it was dark and it was harrowing and it was just not cheerful. There was like little moments of joy in that relationship, but overall very, very tragic, but very, very powerful, and it really made me want to go back and read more Gothic literature and just sort of like go sort of on a like secondary school style analytical deep dive of the genre, and that's all I can ever really ask for a book, can I? So that was great. We then have Irishah and the End of Time by Roshana Chokshi, and I buddy read this with my friend Ashley over at Frolic Through Pages. Any booktubers I mention will be linked down below. But this is from the Rick Riordan Presents series, which I believe are lots of different middle grade books based on different cultures like mythology, folk tales, legendary tales, historical tales, because Rick Riordan was the writer of the Percy Jackson books. And I loved this book. It is based on Indian and Hindu legends, religion, mythology, folklore. And it really made me want to read some more of the originals, so like in the style of like this, I would really like to pick up some original texts about sort of like Hindu gods and maybe explore Indian mythology a little bit more in depth. So I'm sort of looking at books that would be a good starter place for that if you've got any more recommendations, which is wonderful because I imagine in part that's one of like the aims of these middle grade books. Not that you should have to go and read the originals after you read a book inspired by something, but the idea that what makes me want to know more means that it probably makes other younger readers want to know more, and that's a wonderful thing. So this is about Irishah, who lives with her mother in a museum of Indian culture. Her mother runs this museum and is constantly off travelling, finding artefacts for this museum, and because of that Irishah is often like left by herself. She doesn't know who her father was and she can feel often a little bit lonely. She overcompensates by this for telling lots of like outrageous lies to the people she goes to school with so that her life seems much more exciting, and they sort of test her on one of those lies. They push her to light a lamp that's in this museum, and the lamp is supposedly cursed, and Irishah thinks, well, do you know what, nothing bad can really happen if I light this lamp. I will show them, I will do it in front of them, and she does it, and of course it is cursed, and she releases the curse and everything hits the fan, and it's brilliant. I loved it. There's a lot of humour in this book, and I really enjoy humour, particularly in my middle grade. It's not always done well, but when it is, it's excellent, and here it very much is. There's also a sassy animal sidekick, and I love me a talking sassy animal sidekick. Think like Kiro in Cardcaptor Sakura. In this case, however, we got one of my favourite animals, which is the elegant pigeon. Genuinely love me a pigeon, so it was really nice to have the sort of sassy animal sidekick be a pigeon, the one that often knows a lot more and is actually a lot older than the child protagonist but can't do that much because they're trapped in an animal body. And I don't know, that trope works for me in children's literature. But this is also the first in a series, and I think Ashley are going to continue buddy reading the whole series, which is fab because I'm really, really excited to see what happens next. This is one of my favourite middle grade books I've read recently. I thought it was just so imaginative and atmospheric and just wonderful. Loved it, loved it, loved it. But then we have a tiny, tiny little book, and that is Store Animals by Kelly Link. So this is published by Madras Press, who are a small independent publisher who publish books in this little format, these little squares. And quite a few years ago I bought 3 books from them. I read 2 of them and never got around to reading this. So it's just been sitting on the shelves in my mum's house for years, and I finally took this opportunity to pick it up, and I'm so pleased I did because this was lovely. I mean, dark but beautifully written, and I've been meaning to read Kelly Link in general for a very, very long time. As an author, she writes a lot of sort of like magic realism, surreal, fantastical short stories, and potentially novels as well. I have another one of her short story collections. I say another one, this isn't a short story collection, this is just one sort of novella slash long short story. But I do have one of her short story collections on my shelf, which I'm all the more eager to read now that I've read this because her writing is stunning. This is about a family, a mum, a dad, a little boy and a little girl who move into a new house. And it has that sort of haunted house vibe in the fact that weird things start happening when they move there, but it's also like how much of this weirdness is going on in their head and what they're experiencing. Was the mum pregnant? I feel like the mum is pregnant here, so it's like about their whole family dynamic. And there's sort of two main things going on here. One is that all of the members of the family keep feeling like different objects in the house that they've brought to this house from their old apartment are haunted and they can't bear to touch them, so they're just hiding them in this one room, and this one room gets more and more full with all these items that they can't stand to be around. And then also their garden is full of rabbits, so their garden is full of rabbit burrows, and the rabbits come out sometimes and just like sort of completely fill the garden, and it gives you this quite like eerie atmosphere of at night time just all these rabbits sort of sitting there and staring. I mean, I never thought rabbits could be creepy, but they can. And it's just this slightly like surreal story about this family. It's not like plot driven, it's not that kind of story, it's more about the beautiful writing and the atmosphere, and I thought it worked really, really well. I've loved all of the 3 little books I got from Madras Press. I'll link their website down below, so I'm really pleased that I got around to finally reading this last one, and I'm looking forward to reading more by Kelly Link. Can I just say, this is why I usually do 2 wrap-ups in a month, because I feel like I've been here for a while and we still have 4 more books to talk about, but trust me, they're worth it. So the next book I have on my list is another middle grade, and that is The Unseen Guest by Mary Rose Wood, and this is book 3 in the Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place series, which is a middle grade series I've been reading on Scribd to the ebooks. I think the audiobooks are on Scribd as well, but I'm enjoying the ebooks of them, and I've been sort of gradually making my way through them throughout this year because I love these books. These are truly brilliant. These are the kind of books that just make me feel like middle grade is something adults should 100% be reading, because it's full of so much joy and wit and imagination that we can all benefit from no matter what age we're at, and I just love, love, love these books. I will say, however, I don't think this is my favourite. I've given 5 stars to both the previous books. I gave 4 stars to this one, which by no means is a bad rating. I wouldn't even say 3 really is a bad rating, so do not take that to mean I didn't like this book, but I guess it just didn't like bury deep into my soul in the way the first 2 did. But overall I'm still loving the series and can't wait to read book 4. I've talked about it before, so I'll just briefly give you a synopsis of the storyline, but we follow a governess who has just graduated from her school, where she was also raised. It's sort of like an orphanage slash finishing school for young girls and ladies. And she's off on her first ever like professional job as a governess. She travels up to this big household in a rural setting to take care of 3 children. Now these 3 children aren't the biological children of the lord and lady who live in this house, but they're wards. Essentially, the man of this household found these 3 children wild in the woods, living like wolves, a bit like in the Jungle Book, and decides to adopt them because they amuse him and he needs a governess to take care of them. And it's about her discovering the secrets of everyone, basically, of like her employers, these children, herself, her school, things she never knew, and how it's all gradually like knitting together, and I'm really enjoying that. Like, there's certain things that you feel you know from the beginning, although they're never like fully given away, but you also don't understand how it's all going to fit together, and every book you get a little bit further to piecing it together, but you also get like new things flung into the mystery, and you start to think, oh my goodness, is this what's been going on the whole time? And I love that element. I find them really comical in general. Again, I really like the tone of the narrator. It's hard to describe, but there's something about the tone of the narration of these books I really, really enjoy. And in this book, new things happen. I feel like I can't say exactly what happens in book 3 because it would be spoilers for book 1 and 2, but just know that I'm continuing to enjoy this series. We then have Down Among the Dead by Damien Boyd. Now, you may have seen me mention this sort of in other videos recently, that I have been binge watching criminal procedural TV shows, like British crime procedural shows like Broadchurch and The Unforgotten. Recently I watched Keeping Faith. Adoring those kind of things. I don't know what it is, I'm kind of drawn to sort of thrillers and crime stories and darker stories at the moment. The mysteries are really captivating and they're just really enthralling. So I thought, I'm gonna try me a crime procedural book, and I don't think I've ever read a crime, like traditional crime procedural in the vein of those TV shows type books. Like, I've read thrillers for sure, but not necessarily this kind of story. And this one's about DI Nick Dixon, who is involved in a case where they find a body during an archaeological dig in the English countryside. But the body that they discover appears to have been a victim of a serial killer who was incarcerated years ago, and it looks like may potentially have been incarcerated wrongly. And that's one of my favourite tropes in literature, the sort of cold case element to a crime, the idea that we're returning to a case that also connects to something from quite a few years back, so that I really liked. And overall it was just a lot of sort of like intriguing fun. It very much gave me the same vibes that things like Broadchurch or The Unforgotten or other crime procedural TV shows do. It was an easy, quick read that had me sort of wrapped up in the story and curious to see how it would all work out, and I think I'll definitely try and read some more crime procedurals in the future. If you've got any recommendations, please let me know. I just got the first audiobook of the it's a series by Nikki French, Frida Klein, the Frida Klein series by Nikki French, because I know my friend Jen Campbell has been raving about those for a while and I wanted to give them a shot, so I'm going to listen to that soon. But then I have two books which I started in April, which is the month that comes before May, and these were for a vlog. So I read both of these books for my reading books chosen by other booktubers for me. So I asked 3 other booktubers if they would pick a book from my TBR that I should read, and then vlogged reading those 3 books, although as you'll know from that vlog I DNF'd one of them, so I only actually have 2 to wrap up. And if you've seen that video you also know what those are. One is The Wren Hunt by Mary Watson. This is the first in a YA fantasy series. It's a sort of contemporary fantasy series, so it's one of those examples where we're set in the modern world, we follow teenagers in a contemporary setting very similar to our own, but there are magical elements. So in this, I actually thought really interestingly, the characters are druids, so it's based on a lot of sort of like druidic folklore, and I've not really read that before, which I really enjoyed. It's a little twist on that sort of traditional witch trope, I think, that's a lot more common. It's also set in Ireland, and it follows our protagonist Wren, who is a member of this family of druids that are part of like one group. So there's lots of different groups of druids. I think traditionally there's 4, but there's only really 2 now. There's like 4 in their history, but there's 2 now, and they're like massive enemies. Their 2 like clans or groups do not get on, so they kind of have to live in secrecy, so the other sort of like larger, more wealthy group don't know of their existence or who they are, who is a member of their druid family. I don't feel like I'm being very articulate anymore, I've been sitting here for a while. But they've got a mission for her to go and find out some information from the other druids, so she has to sort of infiltrate them, pretend that she's not from her family. There's a little bit of a Romeo and Juliet side plot going on there, and it's a lot of fun. It also airs on the sort of darker side. It's described as a sort of dark fantasy thriller, and I definitely think in parts that's true. But I also just felt reading this book that it's the kind of like YA fantasy that so many people on BookTube would love. I'm so surprised I haven't seen more people talk about it. If you like authors like Holly Black or Moira Fowley Doyle, then I think you would love this book and should 100% give it a read, because I think it's really well written, really interesting storyline, really interesting characters, and I'm excited to read book 2. So that's my thoughts on The Wren Hunt. We then have the last book of this video, yes we are there, and that is Written on the Body by Jeanette Winterson. So I had a rocky relationship with this book overall, and that's purely based on like personal life experiences and preferences to literature, because, and I think it's important to say this beforehand even though it sort of happens midway through the book, but this book ends up becoming in large part about cancer. And I really struggled to read books about cancer, having had the experience of caring for my dad who died of terminal cancer. And it's just something that A, I don't like to be surprised by in books, and B, I sort of just don't want to be the main focus of the stuff I read. I just can't read about it, and it's not because it shouldn't be written about it, but I find it really upsetting and find it really difficult to read about. So by the time I got to the halfway point of the book and we started going in that direction, I just felt like physical discomfort reading it, and that kind of changed my whole experience of the book overall, because it is beautifully written. It's about our protagonists' sort of past relationships and then their relationship with this one woman. One of the things that's unique about this book is we do not know our protagonist's gender identity or sex or what have you throughout the novel. And it's so interesting because reading Goodreads reviews, some people are convinced the protagonist is a man, some people are convinced that they're a woman, some people change their opinions halfway through, and I think that is Jeanette Winterson's intention, that you can never really confirm. And that's really interesting and well done. And again, this isn't really that plot focused, it's more about the writing, but although that's not really a storyline I'd necessarily veer towards, I was interested in reading it because it's Jeanette Winterson and I love her prose, and that is very much true of this book as well. I think her writing is stunning. I think she's one of the most stunning writers out there. I love reading her prose, and in that way I'm always able to take something away from her books, but this lacked the kind of magic realism I often love about her other books. There's not really much of that to it, and then obviously there was just like the whole cancer thing, which threw me off. So I wasn't really able to rate this book because it's beautifully written, and then my discomfort was very, very personal and isn't really a criticism of the book because I don't think there's anything wrong with what she wrote. I just couldn't read about it. I mean, I sort of skimmed that last half and got to the end, but I wouldn't really say I fully absorbed it. So that was kind of my experience with that book, just very personal, I guess. And that brings me to the end of this video. Those are all the books I read in May. I feel like I'm losing my voice slightly, but I'm glad that I got a chance to tell you all about them. Like I said, there were some fantastic books in there, some real standout 5-star reads, and I will link all the books down below, any offers or websites I've mentioned down below, Booktubers I've mentioned down below, and also fundraisers down below. So there's going to be a lot in that description box. Do make sure to open it up and have a look. I would love any recommendations you have for me based on what I've mentioned in this video. I'd love to hear about what you read in May. Were there any standouts for you? Do let me know. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!